Every flight you book from here on out is going to cost you more money. Not because of inflation, not because of summer demand, but because of what happened at 3 in the morning on May 3rd, 2026, when one of America's largest airlines turned off the lights and walked away. No final flights, no press conference, no formal goodbye, just gone. Spirit Airlines, the carrier that flew to 93 destinations, operated 205 aircraft at its peak, and gave tens of millions of Americans a way to travel that they genuinely could not afford before, ceased all operations in the middle of the night. 17,000 people lost their jobs. Passengers were stranded at gates mid-trip, and while those workers got zero severance, Spirit's executives were quietly asking a bankruptcy court to approve $10.7 million in bonuses for themselves. This is not just a business story. This is the story of how one airline's collapse is going to come out of your wallet every time you try to book a flight for the next several years. And once you understand why Spirit actually fell apart, not the surface-level version, but the real layered story, you'll realize this was never going to end any other way. Let's start with what Spirit actually was to the American economy, because most people get this wrong. Spirit Airlines pioneered something that transformed how millions of people could travel. Before Spirit, flying on a budget meant hoping for a sale or using miles. Spirit walked into markets that Delta, American, and United had completely ignored and offered fares so low they looked like typos. And the effect on pricing was staggering. A study of 142 routes where Spirit or a similar ultra-low-cost carrier entered the market found that the lowest available fares dropped by an average of 50%. Not 10%, not 15, 50. When Spirit announced a new route, the big airlines panicked. Delta and United would quietly lower their prices by 20% just to stop Spirit from absorbing their passengers. The Department of Transportation found that overall demand on those routes jumped 60% because suddenly families and workers who had never been able to afford airfare could get on a plane. That's known as the Spirit effect. The presence of one budget carrier on a route was enough to hold prices down for everyone flying that route, regardless of which airline they chose. Spirit didn't just serve budget travelers, it protected every traveler. Now it's gone. On the 90-plus routes Spirit abandoned before its final shutdown, average airfares jumped 23% almost immediately. That's roughly $60 more per round trip, per person, every single time. And those numbers are accelerating. Think about what that means practically. A family of 4 flying from Fort Lauderdale to Dallas is now looking at $240 more per trip minimum. A solo traveler who used Spirit to shuttle between Chicago and Cancun on a $79 one-way is now staring at $140 fares and no real alternative. Spirit didn't just move passengers. It created a class of traveler that could only exist because Spirit existed. Those people don't disappear. They either pay more, drive, or stop taking the trip entirely. So how does this happen? How does an airline with an 82% load factor, planes that were nearly full, go bankrupt? Twice, in less than a year. To understand the collapse, you need to understand the business model. And it really was clever. Spirit didn't sell you a flight. They sold you the absolute minimum right to be physically on the aircraft. Everything else cost money. Carry-on bag, extra charge. Checked bag, extra charge. Seat selection, extra charge. Water and snacks, you'd better believe it. Spirit was the airline where you could book a $29 fare and then discover that your bag cost more than your seat. This wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate strategy called unbundled pricing, and Spirit practically invented it for American aviation. By 2024, more than 50% of Spirit's total revenue wasn't coming from ticket sales at all. It was coming from fees. $774 million a year, just from bags and add-ons, strip the base fare down to nothing, attract passengers who otherwise wouldn't fly, then make your margin on the extras. For years this worked. Spirit grew from a small regional Midwest carrier into the 7th largest passenger airline in North America. Then one by one, every single thing that could go wrong did. The first and most fatal crack was this. The legacy airlines started doing Spirit's trick better than Spirit could. Delta launched Basic Economy, then American, then United. These were stripped-down fares that matched Spirit's price on the same routes, but with the infrastructure of a massive airline behind them. Reliable planes, coast-to-coast networks, working apps, loyalty miles that actually meant something. When Delta can match your $49 fare and also offer you a functioning departure experience with status credits, what is Spirit's competitive advantage anymore? Their entire reason for existing was price. The moment price disappeared as a differentiator, Spirit was already in trouble. But Spirit's management had an answer: sell the airline. In February of 2022, Frontier Airlines announced it would buy Spirit for $6.6 billion. Two ultra-low-cost carriers merging into one entity big enough to hold their ground against the giants. It made strategic sense. Then JetBlue came in with an unsolicited counteroffer, and Spirit's board took the deal. And then something that sounds almost impossible happened. For 2 full years, Spirit was locked in merger limbo. They couldn't expand routes aggressively. They couldn't make major capital decisions. They couldn't bring in new management with a fresh mandate. They were just waiting when the Biden DOJ sued to block the JetBlue-Spirit merger in March of 2023 on antitrust grounds, and when a federal judge ruled the deal unlawful in January of 2024, Spirit finally emerged from the limbo, financially weaker than when it entered, with no merger on the horizon and no clear strategic path. JetBlue formally walked away in March of 2024, and the clock started ticking hard. Then the engines literally started failing. Pratt & Whitney, the manufacturer of the turbofan engines powering Spirit's Airbus A320neo jets, discovered a manufacturing defect that required complete engine removal, inspection, and in many cases full replacement. At the worst point, up to 40 of Spirit's planes were simultaneously grounded waiting for repairs. Each repair took over 400 days. Spirit was operating 200 aircraft. Suddenly, 40 of them weren't flying. They were still paying lease rates on every single one of those planes. The revenue was gone. The cost stayed. Pratt & Whitney paid Spirit somewhere between $150 and $200 million in compensation. It was nowhere near enough. At the exact same time, Spirit's pilots and flight attendants were finalizing new contracts. Long overdue, the workers hadn't seen real raises in years. But the new agreements increased labor costs by 18 to 22% in a single year. Spirit's cost per available seat mile hit 11.35 cents. Their revenue per available seat mile was approximately 10.2 cents. That means Spirit was spending more money to put a passenger in a seat than it was making from that passenger. With an 82% load factor, planes nearly full, still burning $3 million every single day, Spirit filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in November of 2024. In a prepackaged deal that moved fast, they cut the debt by $795 million, slashed the fleet from 205 aircraft down to 76, and raised $350 million in new equity. They emerged from bankruptcy in 87 days. The restructuring plan looked viable. On paper, the projections showed a $252 million profit in the first quarter post-emergence. They assumed jet fuel would cost $2.24 per gallon. Then the Iran war happened. U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran sent global oil markets into shock. Jet fuel prices doubled almost overnight. By the time Spirit was executing its restructuring, actual fuel was running $4.51 per gallon, more than double what the plan assumed. In the 2 months of March and April 2026 alone, the fuel cost overrun was approximately $100 million that Spirit simply did not have. That projected $252 million profit flipped to a $257 million loss. Spirit filed for bankruptcy a second time in August of 2025. In the industry, a company that goes bankrupt twice is called a Chapter 22, a dark play on the double filing. Spirit became the most prominent Chapter 22 in U.S. airline history. The final play was a $500 million government loan, a federal bailout that would have given the government up to 90% equity in Spirit, essentially a partial nationalization of a discount airline. The talks dragged for weeks. Bondholders couldn't agree on terms. The politics were awkward on every side. On May 3, 2026, at 3 in the morning, CEO David Davis sent a message to Spirit's employees that ended the airline's 34-year run in 4 words. We just kind of ran out of runway. Now here is the detail that should stick with you. While Spirit was in its final bankruptcy proceedings, while 17,000 employees were losing their jobs with no severance, no health insurance continuation, nothing. Spirit's management submitted a request to the bankruptcy court for $10.7 million in executive retention bonuses, an average of $76,000 per executive. The people who ran the airline into the ground twice in under a year wanted extra compensation to stick around long enough to oversee the wind down. The court was handling the request. The workers were handling the loss on their own. That's not a side detail, it's the clearest picture you'll see of how corporate bankruptcy actually works in this country. Now let's talk about what this means for every American who flies, including people who never set foot on a Spirit plane. Spirit was the price floor. On every route they operated, their presence forced every other carrier to price more competitively. That pressure is gone. Frontier is moving aggressively into Spirit's old markets and is openly forecasting a 3 to 5% revenue increase, meaning they expect to charge more per seat now that Spirit isn't undercutting them. At Fort Lauderdale, Spirit's main hub, JetBlue added 11 new destinations, Breeze added 8 new routes, Frontier added 9. None of them are pricing at what Spirit charged. They're absorbing the passengers and raising the fares because the market will now hold it. On routes Spirit abandoned before the full shutdown, fares were already up an average of 23%, about $60 more per round trip. In the weeks after the final shutdown, the average jump across all former Spirit routes hit 14%. That number will keep climbing as the competitive floor continues to erode. You're going to feel this most in the secondary markets, the routes between mid-sized cities, the beach destinations, the routes that legacy carriers don't treat as priorities. Spirit made those routes affordable. Without them, get ready to pay. The bigger question now is whether Spirit's collapse is a one-off or a signal. The business case for an ultra-low-cost carrier made complete sense when the major airlines refused to go below a certain price point. That era is over. Delta, American, and United can now match a budget carrier's fare on a bad day and subsidize the loss with co-branded credit card revenue worth billions annually, money that has nothing to do with selling seats. They have financial firepower that Spirit could never replicate. They can weather a fuel spike that would destroy a carrier operating on single-digit margins. Frontier is the next closest thing to what Spirit was. Allegiant runs a smarter, more insulated model, leisure routes bundled with vacation packages, which gives them pricing power Spirit never had. Breeze and Avelo are too small and too young to anchor a market. If fuel prices stay elevated and legacy carriers keep pushing basic economy products into the routes where budget carriers are most exposed, the math may stop working for the rest of the ULCC sector too. The last time a major U.S. airline collapsed like this was 25 years ago. Most Americans have never booked a flight in a world where a major carrier just ceases to exist. Spirit just showed everyone what it looks like, and the lesson is simple. When your entire competitive advantage is price, when that's the only card in your hand, you are always one bad quarter from the runway running out. Spirit's fares were never actually cheap. They were cheap because Spirit had absolutely no other choice. And now that the choice is gone, you'll be paying the difference. So tell me in the comments, did you ever fly Spirit? And do you think the ultra-low-cost model was always doomed, or did external events kill something that had a real future? If this changed the way you think about airfare and the economics behind the ticket price, hit the like button and send this to someone who books flights and thinks budget airlines are invincible. Subscribe and stay close, because next we're breaking down how airline loyalty programs are now worth more than the airlines themselves. And what happens to those miles sitting in your account when a carrier shuts down?